Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Easter version of worship. The Lord has risen and the tomb is empty. And yet, an empty grave didn't help the first followers to trust God. And I think the same is true for us. We need more than an empty grave to help us to live today with trust that God is with us and helping us. I think we need an encounter, just like the first followers needed an encounter. Mary Magdalene met him, Peter, James, John, Thomas, all of them. Fortunately, we have a God who looks for us and finds us in the most unlikely places. A reading from John chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. Early on, the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. And he saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside, and he saw and believed. They did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb, and she wept. She bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not recognize it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned toward him and cried in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them all that he had said to her. The early Christians had a tradition, and every Easter they would say to each other, "The Lord has risen." And then the reply was, "He has risen indeed." The Lord has risen. So this morning I was out walking the dog, and I'm thinking about what to tell you this Easter. You know, I look at these narratives every year, the story, the Easter story every year. And I think, now what's the angle for this one? What will I concentrate on? And as I was walking this morning, I started to recall past Easters. And I started to think about Easter as a child and my memories of Easter as a child. And when I was a kid, the thing that stands out more than anything else about Easter is bacon rolls. Now, I know it's maybe not what you would expect, but when I think back, I have it's a good memory because as a part of the Easter celebration, we would go outside up on the hill. Actually, it was called Binnycraig. It was always cold. Often there was ice on the ground, even though it was spring, it was cold, Scotland. One of my fondest memories is coming down from that hill and going into what we call the church hall, like our fellowship hall. And there the bacon would be frying. And that's one of my fondest memories of Easter. And you know, memory is an interesting thing. You know, when you remember an event or you remember things from the past, it's really interesting what sort of pops up for you and what you remember. And the passage that I just read in John is basically John's memory of what actually happened that very first Easter morning, because of course he was present. He was present there at the grave that first Easter morning, and he wrote down his memory of that morning. And he's a great writer, John, because he gives us lots of detail. But I think he's almost like a mystery writer because he doesn't spell everything out for you. John's very content to leave you wondering at the end of his Easter story, because he leaves lots and lots of questions unanswered, and he's fine with that. He doesn't like to sew it all up. So he's the kind of writer that when you finished reading John, you have lots of questions. I think John would be very comfortable with that. He likes to keep things, let's just say he's open. He doesn't like to sew things up too tightly. And he's very comfortable with mystery. Very comfortable with mystery. And I think that's a really great thing to be as soon as you start talking about spiritual realities and our spiritual lives. I think we have to move into another realm altogether and get very, very comfortable with mystery and very comfortable with unanswered questions and not necessarily knowing the answer to everything and being fine with that. It's all part of it. So I'm just going to give you a tiny piece of the story. John tells us that after Jesus died, he was buried. He died on the Friday. He was buried. This happens on Monday morning. The story happens on Monday morning. Well, our Monday morning. So he was buried on the Friday, and on the Monday morning, one of his closest companions goes to the grave, and she's horrified to find out that the grave is empty. Now, she had been with him on Friday when he died, and he was buried. And then after Friday, it was Sabbath, so nothing could be done. So the next day she comes, which would be our Sunday, really, if you do it in that sequence. So she's of course alarmed. She goes to the grave. The grave's empty. There's nothing there. She's completely alarmed. She goes and she runs and she tells James and John, two of Jesus' closest companions and disciples and students. Now all these people, Mary and James and John, Peter, everybody in the Easter story knows Jesus really well. I mean, they have been with him. These are the disciples that have been with him for over 3 years, listening to him, watching him heal, looking at his teachings and his miracles and his healings and all the wisdom. So they know him, and they've watched him heal countless people. So when Mary sees an empty grave, she saw him die, she saw him crucified on the Friday, she saw him put in the grave, which would be a cave. When she goes to visit the gravesite and he's not there, she thinks that somebody's moved the body. That's her first reaction. Now, What's fascinating about the story is that everybody has different reactions. And this is where we'll see ourselves in this story. Everybody receives the news differently. Mary thinks the body's been moved. She's horrified and she goes and gets Peter and John. Now, when Peter and John get to the grave, Peter walks into the grave. Remember, it's a cave, so you can kind of go in there and see what's going on. Peter walks into the grave, and John tells us in the passage, in the scripture, that Peter saw, he looked in there and he saw the grave clothes. He saw the grave clothes. Obviously, Jesus isn't there, but the cloths that he was wrapped in are still there. And the head covering, what we would call the shroud, I suppose, the head covering was also there. Now, the passage tells us that Peter saw, the word is blepo, which means a quick glance. There's a quick glance at this strange sight. All these grave clothes lying there, and yet there's no body. And that's it. That's all we're told. He just sees, and it's like no response. I mean, if he had a response, we don't know what his response is because the text is silent. And then John goes in to the grave and he sees the grave cloths, but the word is a different word in the original language. It's a completely different word. It's horao, which means to pierce with intelligent comprehension. So John goes in, looks, sees the grave cloths, sees the grave cloth that covered Jesus' head neatly folded in a separate place where laid down where Jesus' head would have been. He looks in the grave and he sees something, but he has a different response from Peter altogether. He sees, it's like, oh. And the passage tells us he believes. He sees and he believes. Peter looks at the grave, he's speechless. John, it's like, John has this aha moment, which is something like, oh, you mean that part that he told us that he would die, but he would be raised again? Is that what's happening here? I mean, Jesus did tell us. He told us that he would go to Jerusalem. He told us that he would suffer. He told us he would die. And he also told us that he would be raised up on the third day. John's thinking, is this the third day? Is this what he said? And he has this moment of insight, a moment of clarity. It's like, yeah, this is the one who said, and Jesus had told them this many times, I'll never leave you. Jesus had told them, I'll always be with you. Death can't separate us. Death won't separate us. Death won't keep me away. I'll be raised up again on the third day. So fascinating because, you know, this whole idea about coming to faith or believing that we're not in this life alone, which is really what faith is all about. I mean, I think that if you believe, basically what you're saying is that you're saying, what I'm saying is that I'm not in this life all by myself to work things out all alone because I believe that God is with me. I think that's basically what faith is at its simplest. It's like I believe that God is with me in this life and on into the next. It's so fascinating to me that everyone needs different things. You know, so when Peter looks in to the empty grave, that wasn't going to do it for him. And when Mary came to the empty grave, no, that's not going to work for her. But when John went to the empty grave and saw the cloths all neatly folded, he did see something, and he got an insight. So it's like we all need different things, and what's an insight to one person isn't necessarily an insight to another. That's why you can never really compare yourself spiritually with anyone else, because we're so radically different, and we're all in different places. But it seems to be, especially it shows itself in this story, one of the truths is that everyone comes to trust God at different times and learns to trust God little by little in different ways. So what works for John won't work for Mary. What works for me won't work for you. It's like God works with us individually. Like, for example, remember I told you early on that my first experience was the bacon sandwich, right? My first experience was the bacon roll. That was the first thing that kind of caught my attention about the church. It was really simple. I mean, I'm really young, right? But it was pretty simple. Here are people that are enjoying themselves. And, even as a kid, you know if people are enjoying themselves, you know if people like to be together. And you're happy if you're around people that are enjoying one another. I'm with a group of people who are enjoying one another, drinking cups of tea and having bacon sandwiches. To me, as a kid, that was a good thing. Later on, it wasn't the bacon sandwiches that got my attention, it was music. It was music. And I remember my friend Lynn and I we were really young at the time. I think I was maybe like 10 or something. Because remember, Lynn and I went to choir practice. And the choir director was really surprised, because this was an adult choir. And here's these two little girls coming in, like 10 years old or something, 10 or 11. And it's like, well, what do you sing? It's like, I don't know. I didn't know if I was a soprano, alto, whatever. I just knew that I was drawn to music. And, for the longest time, it was never sermons or teachings that I was aware of. I was never aware of any sermon or teaching giving me any insight into God. It was music. It was music. That was the drawing force for me. And it wasn't until I was quite old, till I was over 20, that I started to listen to teachings and understand a little bit more, or even read the teachings of Jesus. So for the longest time, God would use music to just move me that little bit closer and closer to trusting. I'm still learning, of course, right? But everybody needs different things. Mary needed to hear her name called. Later on, you can read about that. Thomas needed to touch Jesus, he said. Thomas said, I can't go by what everyone else is saying. I have to experience this for myself, and I need to touch him. Peter needed to forgive himself before he could move on. He needed a completely different way. He needed to get some things sorted out from his past before he could move ahead and trust. And it takes time. Faith, trust. I mean, we're going to be learning how to trust to the end of our days. But even at the beginning, it all just seems to take time. It's not always clear. Our relationship with God is similar in a way to our relationship with people. Although the difference is that God never changes, and God's always steadfast, and God's always loving, and God's always faithful. But having a relationship, there can be ups and downs. You go through really good times together where you're feeling like you're close, and then you're going through a plateau of sorts, and then you go through a bad patch. And there's lots of ups and downs and hills and valleys to relationships, as it is to our life, right? It's the same way with our spiritual lives. It's the same way with our understanding of God. We grow, usually quite slowly, And it feels like one step forward, two steps back. If you're a doubter, if you're a bit of a skeptic, you'll relate to somebody like Thomas. Because that was Thomas. Thomas is like, I can't believe just because you tell me to believe. You know, I'm not put together that way. I can't believe just because you say believe. I can't believe just because you're all enthusiastic about it. No, it's not working for me. Thomas would say, I need my own way. I need to, and Jesus would say, fine, that's fine. I understand that. That can be worked out. I mean, I'm giving you a paraphrase, right? But that's actually what did happen. It was worked out in such a way that Thomas could receive and that Thomas could understand. In other words, Jesus met Thomas and gave him what he needed. Jesus met John and gave him what he needed. Jesus met Mary. They're all different. And you know, no one found Jesus that first Easter morning. It was always Jesus finding them, or Jesus finding us. So it's not necessarily our task to try and, frantically look for God. It's like, no. Jesus would say, I know exactly where you are. I know exactly what you need. And I am coming to you. I have come to you. I will continue to come to you because I want us to be in this life together, partnered together. He's got a lovely phrase where he says, take my yoke upon you. It's kind of like, come alongside me. Let's do this together. You don't need to do this by yourself. That's the call. It's always been the call, never changes. It's always the same. It's like, come and follow me. And I'll be with you and give you everything you need. And that means everything. Amen.
Everyone needs compassion, love that's never fading. Let mercy fall on me. Everyone needs forgiveness, the kindness of a Savior, the hope of nations. Savior,